Okay, I think we should begin. It's just after 5 o'clock. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We really appreciate your being here. I'm Laurie-Marie Pisciotta, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mental Health Association. Tonight is the first of 3 Integration for All town halls where we discuss Olmstead plans. This particular lively panel discussion will focus on what an Olmstead plan is and what it can do for Rhode Islanders. First, just a few housekeeping tips. This event will run from 5 o'clock to approximately 6:30. The event will be closed captioned. The event will also be recorded and posted on our website after the event for a period of time. Attendees are muted and we are not able to see you on camera. The only people who will be seen on camera are the actual panelists for tonight's discussion. If any attendees have a question, please go ahead and type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom page. And we will take questions from the panelists toward the end of the discussion, probably around 6 o'clock or just after that. After tonight, I challenge everyone to please consider what you can do to help the hundreds of vulnerable Rhode Islanders with disabilities who might be living on the streets or in prison or in nursing homes. You could do something like contact your elected officials and ask for an Olmstead plan. You could volunteer at an organization. You can write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper. You have more power than you think, and I encourage you to use it. So let's begin by introducing our esteemed panelists this evening. We are very grateful for the time that they are giving us. Marc Anthony Gallucci is an attorney who is deaf. He's been advocating for changing systems and attitudes toward people with disabilities for decades. Currently, the Executive Director of Ocean State Center for Independent Living, and he was previously the Executive Director and Chief Advocate at the Center for Disability Rights in Connecticut, where he played a role in bringing about Connecticut's Olmstead and ADA compliance on a statewide basis. Welcome, Marc Anthony. Bob Cooper has been the Executive Secretary of the Governor's Commission on Disability since 1980. He was active in the drafting of the ADA and was at the White House July 26, 1990, when it was signed by President George H.W. Bush. Welcome. Robert Marshall is a policy consultant for the Rhode Island Developmental Disabilities Council. He spent his entire career in human services, and he also is the sibling of an adult with developmental disabilities. Mary Marran has served as president and COO at Butler Hospital here in Providence for the past 3 years and is senior vice president at Care New England, responsible for the behavioral health service line at Care New England. Mary is also right now the interim president and COO at the Providence Center during the center's current leadership transition. Lastly, Mary serves as the vice chair of the board of directors for the Hospital Association of Rhode Island, and she's committed to expanding behavioral health services for all Rhode Islanders, believing strongly that timely access and behavioral health services will serve to improve the overall health and well-being of Rhode Islanders. Lastly, Meg Klingham was scheduled to be here. Meg is from the Office of the Mental Health Advocate in Rhode Island. Unfortunately, she's not able to be present tonight because she is testifying in a House Finance Committee on Eleanor Slater Hospital. I welcomed her to join us late if she's able to, and we'll see if she can. So welcome to all of our panelists. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the attendees joining us. Perhaps it makes sense to begin by explaining to the audience what an Olmstead plan is and to put it in context. So over 100 years ago, people with disabilities, including mental illness, were confined in asylums, which often had dismal living conditions. It was not uncommon, in fact, for the patients to be abused by the staff and literally shackled in place. Clifford Beers, the founder of the mental hygiene movement, and also the founder of the first mental health association in this country, lived in these asylums because he also suffered from mental illness, and he experienced firsthand the poor living conditions and abuse. In 1908, Clifford Beers wrote an autobiography entitled A Mind That Found Itself, which chronicled the abuse he endured while he was institutionalized. He gained the respect of doctors and soon began a national movement to deinstitutionalize people with disabilities. Clifford Beers asked for asylums all over the country to send him their iron shackles, which he helped melt down and form a 300-pound Liberty Bell, which still exists today at Mental Health America's Virginia headquarters. If you want to see a video of this bell, you can go to our website and click on the About Us tab to see the bell in action. So fast forward 100 years later to the future, to 1999, when the United States Supreme Court ruled on a case called Olmstead v. LC. In this case, the court found that segregation of people with disabilities is discrimination under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The court decided that states have a legal obligation to ensure that individuals with disabilities have the opportunity to live, work, and receive services in the community in the least restrictive setting permitted by their disabilities. An Olmstead plan, therefore, is the framework through which a state intends to comply with this legal obligation. So almost all the states in our country have an Olmstead plan. Rhode Island is one of 7 that do not. And this has a direct impact on the lives of older adults, people with physical disabilities, developmental disabilities, and serious and persistent mental illness. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg authored the majority opinion in the Olmstead case, and in it she wrote, "Recognition that unjustified institutional isolation of persons with disabilities is a form of discrimination and reflects 2 evident judgments. First, institutional placement of persons who can handle and benefit from community settings perpetuates unwarranted assumptions that persons so isolated are incapable or unworthy of participating in community life. Second," she goes on to write, "confinement in an institution severely diminishes the everyday life activities of individuals, including their family relations, social contacts, work options, economic independence, educational advancement, and cultural enrichment." We hope to make Justice Ginsburg proud tonight. So let's get on with the discussion. And this first question is for any panelist who wants to tackle it first. And the question is, in the late 1980s and 90s, Rhode Island was considered one of the best systems of care for developmental disabilities and mental illness in the country. What were we doing back then that shaped our success, and what changed over the decades? Again, this is open to any panelist who wants to tackle it.
I think from the developmental disabilities end, I think a lot of that was driven by us being one of the first to close all of our institutions, which was hard. Wasn't hard because we only had one. So we either had an open institution or we didn't. And the other states that had multiples started on that path, and many of them still haven't quite finished. And I think a lot of the change came about over time. Is I think we rode on that early piece, and we didn't keep changing as the treatment models changed across the country. And I think that's a lot of why we lost it. And then the final piece was some finance issues that happened in the 80s and 90s that really finished it off for developmental disabilities, where the budgets went way down and still haven't recovered.
In the area of children's behavioral health, in one instance, our chief advocate in the state Senate got himself elected to Congress and then eventually moved on to the US Senate, and that's Jack Reed. Um, and again, we had we started with one of the best systems in the country. And then over time, through budget changes and shifts of where services were, gradually diminished the level of service. When I first got active in this field, the mental health system was cradle to grave. And when they decided to create a department, originally a department for children, they pulled the behavioral health care system out of that. So then it became in competition with the rest of the child protective services. And there were many more advocates and louder voices from the families and in the child protection, child welfare system, which also ran, unfortunately, the children's justice system. And it became, to an extent, it became the stepchild getting only what was left in the pot.
I think, as well, in the early 80s, that's about when I actually began my career and arrived in Rhode Island. And the community mental health center system was far more robust. The presence of more expansive day treatment, supported work, it was a national leader at that time. And also on the private nonprofit front here at Butler, we were able to enjoy a much longer relationship to a patient who required acute hospitalization. So when I arrived in Rhode Island, it was, length of stay was probably 18 to 20 days average. Now it's 7. So when we need to stabilize and prepare someone for return to community, not only are we handcuffed by shorter lengths of stay, we have community mental health centers that aren't able to provide the same expansive services that made us so successful back in the early 80s, at least in my view. I don't know if others have more to say about that.
Mary, may I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
You said, years ago, a patient who had an inpatient stay in Butler Hospital would be there for maybe 18 days, and now that's been reduced to maybe on average about 7 days. Mm-hmm. Is that a result of health insurers coming into the picture and having the ultimate say in what happens to those patients?
Yeah, I think, if you watch the hospital in terms of utilization of the hospital, with the arrival of managed care, that put great pressure on us and ended up resulting in, this dramatic reduction in services. So indeed, the change in the payer relationship has had significant impact. I can say that, there was a point where that not only limited time in hospital, limited access to needed hospitalization. And I think we've overcome that, and we have a much more collaborative relationship with payers and looking at how to best serve individuals that need our care, not only in the hospital, but through that transition out of the hospital. But certainly the payer component of this had an impact on that length of stay. But I want to stress that, and I think this is important to the Olmstead plan and the conversation, that it really is about what we've done to our community services and the changes in funding to our mental health centers, and some of the critical elements that are noted when you look at Olmstead plans that truly impact a person's ability to be successful in recovery, but also to manage, you know, in the most integrated way, in, you know, outside of institutions or segregated, you know, living. So it's important to our conversation, because that's a component we're going to have to pay attention to if we're going to do this successfully.
Agreed. Any other comments before we move on?
So
Okay, then Mike. Oh, sorry.
the only other thing is that we should recognize that the first psychiatric hospital for children is in Rhode Island. You know, Bradley. You know, it was, you know, a leader in a time in which, for most children and adults with significant, persistent needs, were just locked away someplace.
This question is for you, Bob. Would you mind giving us the basic about what an Olmstead plan actually is? What are the components of a plan? What does it do? And, you know, you can feel free to touch on issues from affordable, accessible housing to housing supports, educational supports, employment supports.
Well, it's actually all of those. And we should really look at it at two levels. One is the government in their process of ensuring there's as much inclusion and integration as possible. But at the other level, it really should be person-centered and self-directed. Take an example. Tonight, there's a discussion going on about what the state should be doing with its only public hospital, the Eleanor Slater Hospital. And part of planning that should be done before we think about moving anybody out is what systems and support are out in the community. Are they properly funded? Are they comprehensive? So yes, it's not just that you're given a discharge date and some relative comes and picks you up, as unfortunately a number of families have been led to believe is what's coming out of the transition in Slater. But it's having access to affordable housing with appropriate supports, having access to transportation, to be able to get to not just services you might need, but also just being able to get to the grocery store, and if you need somebody to assist you in buying those groceries or anything else. It really needs to be well thought out. And at this point, you know, we don't have enough steps from a long-term residential setting to being out in the community, at some point potentially totally independent. We need to keep in mind, long before the Supreme Court decision, going back into the 60s, where we had Ed Roberts and the rest of the rolling quads at Berkeley campus of the University of California. And they were some of the first people to say, as college-age students, we shouldn't be pushed to only live in a nursing home. At 20 years old, we need to be able to be out in the community with appropriate supports. And that's why we need to do it at two levels. It needs to be, one, we develop the services in the community. We funded them to a level in which they can retain their staff. And I'm sure Mary and others will tell you, we don't fund at the state level to be able to keep people when we're frequently competing with the burger joint down the street. And it needs to be fully comprehensive. Once we get the broad brush, then it really needs to be creating a plan for each individual. Again, if we go back to where we're looking at right now, and that is Eleanor Slater, every one of those people should have their own plan. And it should be driven by what they desire. When you think about the folks up at Zambrano, some of them have been at Zambrano since a week after they were born. And none of the family members who are alive even know they have a brother or a sister or uncle or aunt who's at Zam. For them, deinstitutionalizing may be such a psychiatric shock to them, in addition to any physical limitations they may have and medical limitations, that would be the worst thing to do for them.
Feel free to chime in, anyone else.
I just want to comment because I also think a component that there has to be as we look at an Olmstead plan, it is going to be important that we do put in these critical elements, but that there's an element of that being more fluid. We have to do a better job of helping the severely mentally ill and our individuals that have intellectual and developmental disabilities, to give them the appropriate response to emergent psychiatric needs and a system that can appropriately manage those exacerbations, hopefully in the community, but certainly if they need hospitalization, that same step down need that you're talking about from long-term residential is needed out of hospitals. Hospitals like my own have to be much more community facing, connected and integrated with the community providers, so that when an individual living in the community particularly with severe mental illness or within the IDD population, that our work is more community based and doesn't end up isolating them in a hospital like mine or Rhode Island or any of the hospitals where then they get stuck and there's really no easy transition back to the community. So we need a far more robust mental health, behavioral health, outpatient community system and we don't have that right now. We really are limited, particularly with the IDD population, in providing that treatment. It's something that we're trying to actually grow and expand as part of our outpatient and ambulatory services here, because it's such a significant need. But it does require that all of these providers across that continuum can interact and have linkages that effectively let the individual live as independently and in as integrated a setting as possible. And that's going to be an important component to be sure that we have in play.
Do any of you have an opinion as to permanent hospitalization, for perhaps the example that Bob just mentioned, this person who's been in Eleanor Slater Hospital pretty much since they were born? Is there an opinion as to permanent hospitalization being a legitimate option on the continuum of care from outpatient to permanent hospitalization? Or should hospitalization, is it possible that hospitalization could be reserved just for acute issues and then the person goes back into the community? Or will we always need that option for people? It's open to anyone.
I think that option is similar to the same issue with congregate care. I mean, should congregate care exist or not exist? And a lot of that's got to be driven on what the person needs at the time, and it might not be acute. It might be fairly long term that someone needs that, if that's what they really want and need, then it should be available to them. But what happens is that a lot of times you get there and in those situations, people stop being given the choices. And so it just kind of continues because it continues and for no other reason. And I think the other big thing that we got to worry about in planning any reduction of hospitalization or congregate care is that a mistake I think that we made when we started closing institutions is we didn't do any planning for the people that would have gone to the institution. We did a lot of planning for the people we needed to get out, but we just assumed that all those other people that would have gone there would just kind of fit in somehow, and that became both a funding issue and became a transition issue that took years and years to get addressed and still isn't fully addressed.
I think that's the critical statement. It isn't, fully addressed, and that need for a more long-term acute care setting is critical. There are patients who need a longer period of stabilization, who can, who otherwise just continue to fail in the community and present, cyclically to EDs and hospitals, and really quite disruptive, for that person. So that acceptance that I sort of lean towards there probably is a need for long-term congregate or hospital level of services for some portion of this population. I do think that that's probably still, there's some level still needed there, particularly if individual choice is part of this. Some people who have been living, at Eleanor Slater, that's what they know. That's, where they've been, and they may not want to move, to a lesser restrictive setting. I think we have to, respect that. And then I think there's people that are just going to need that level of care because of physical and behavioral issues. But that need for a longer term setting to stabilize beyond an acute phase of an illness is so apparent to me. And right now, our system just gets clogged up. So we have an LTAC unit, but it doesn't decompress because there's nowhere really to migrate and transition folks, to out of that setting. So we're all, we've got a lot of people staying in places where they don't necessarily need to be.
We also need to keep in mind that people age, their needs change. We have a lot of folks who came out of LAD Center and are now need geriatric care. And you've got we see from time to time problems between senior services, whether it's meals or other things at a senior center, and then you've got folks coming in with intellectual, developmental disabilities, and there's a great deal of hostility in being a more inclusive senior center.
Mark, Anthony, I wonder if there is perhaps one or two critical gaps that you feel need to be met with an Olmstead plan.
Yes, thank you for asking that. I've been largely quiet up to this point because, as you know, I'm fairly new to Rhode Island, so I can't participate too much in a discussion about how Rhode Island was and how did it change and et cetera, because I'm not expert in that area. But in the short amount of time I have been here in Rhode Island, I have learned that the state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantation has the highest rate of institutionalization in the country by far. And there are really very few good options for people who want to avoid nursing homes and other institutions and the services that are in place to help people leave nursing homes or avoid nursing homes. There are several of them, and they are, in fact, doing a pretty good job. And we have some of them here at Osher State Center for Independent Living. But I did notice that there's a lot of gaps because there's a lot of requirements around financial need and functional abilities and et cetera. And a lot of people fall through those gaps. And this is why people end up in nursing homes and never get out. And so to me, I look at that and I see so many things we can do, from changing people's attitudes, because in Rhode Island, that seems to be the attitude, well, go to a nursing home. That's the default attitude. That needs to be changed. But Rhode Island also needs to understand fundamentally the root causes as to why people end up in institutions. And it's not just that, well, there's a bias toward institutionalization. That's part of it. But the other part of it is simply that the services that people need are not there. And our communities are not designed in a way that they are barrier-free, meaning that they are free of physical barriers, communicative barriers, and attitudinal barriers for that matter. That's what the focus needs to be. I thought it was interesting that you started this with a quote from Justice Ginsburg, because I usually quote Sandra Day O'Connor and her comments about the least restrictive environment. But what's interesting about Ginsburg's take on it was that she said, look, when we put people in nursing homes or institutions and we don't give them another option, what we're doing is we're taking away their ability to participate in the community, get an education, get a job, recreate, socialize, go to church, whatever. And that was not, believe it or not, at the time, what those of us who are disability advocates were thinking of. We thought of Olmstead is about applying the ADA, saying that, aha, Medicaid services need to be in the least restrictive environment, along with other state services. So that's what we were looking at the time. And shame on us, because who knows better than people who are advocates in the disability community that the real problem lies in the environment around us in our communities, that we have to work on making them accessible and changing attitude, and then some of these other problems work themselves out. So to me, the gaps, I mean, we can talk about specific things like lack of housing, lack of transportation, but fundamentally, we want to talk about removing barriers in the community, and we're not doing enough of that. And we're continuing to build our communities and erect buildings that have barriers everywhere.
Thank you, Marc. I feel all fired up now. That was terrific. Thank you. Bob Marshall, I have a question for you. What are the human and financial costs of not having an Olmstead plan in Rhode Island? Can you speak to that?
Sure. The first thing is that people don't know that they have options. I mean, I think that is the biggest cause, is when people start losing.
Oh, I'm sorry, your sound paused. Perhaps.
There usually isn't even enough of, so it's like, well, you're not in a crisis yet. So a lot of this stuff keeps getting handled in crisis situations, which is not the way that us plan out our life. I mean, we plan out our life and then we deal with the crises after. When you start getting into people that need supports to be in the community, it ends up being, well, there's a crisis, so we got a bed over here, that's what you're gonna get. And I think a big piece of that is we've got to look at separating where you live from where you get services. I think that really needs to happen. It is driving too much of this system, and it is really limiting people's choice, because you got to have a bed to sleep in at night. And if that's tied to a service model that you don't want, you're either going to go sleep in your parents' house on the street, or you're going to go in the service model you don't want. And I think think that's one of the big things we've got to deal with. I think the other piece is a lot of this stuff, a lot of the movement from the bureaucrats and the legislature towards more integrated um, services is they see it as a way, they always see it as a way to save money. And that might even be possible in the long run. The problem is they want the money right away. And I think a lot of times when you're moving to these models, you actually need more money up front, because if you want someone to be fully integrated that needs supports, they're going to need supports getting integrated as well as the supports they need just to get through the day. But if you get some of those supports and you get them integrated, then some of that stuff can stop falling off, because if you really are integrated in the community,
I think your internet slowed down a little bit.
it's getting a paycheck because you've got other people following you around because they like you. So, I think, and then the other big piece is it's always hard. You kind of talk.
Oh, I think we lost you. I'm sorry, Bob. I think that the internet slowed down for you because you're frozen. But perhaps the rest of us can continue on what Bob was saying. Anyone want to add their 2 cents?
I think Bob is exactly right, that this is like, this will require an investment.
Yeah.
And will cost more money up front. But I actually, and I think there's evidence in some, service models that, a few years down the road, it actually is more cost effective and you realize greater savings. So, here we sit in the middle of a pandemic where the state budget is challenged like never before, where healthcare and all of the providers are strapped, and it's going to be a big climb to convince our leaders that this is the right step, and it's the right step now. But it will most certainly cost more money. As we sit here, I know we're all well aware that the conversation about Slater is going on in the House Finance Committee, and there is a significant savings that is being attributed to changes in that system. But again, there will be upfront expense, and down the road savings. What we're talking about here is so critical to and so connected to that conversation right now, in that without an Olmstead plan and a roadmap for how we're going to do this, then we should really worry about what we're doing at the state hospital. We need to tie these two things together.
I agree. They're intricately intertwined. I was very excited to learn that Rhode Island is eligible for $5 million from the Medicaid Money Follows the Person program, which aims to take people who are living in nursing homes and put them back in the community. And the money that Medicaid was paying for the nursing home follows the person into the community so they can have services at home. I was also very pleased to hear that we've also committed $5 million to the START program, which is an evidence-based program for people who live with developmental disabilities. And these are both very encouraging to me. And I just wonder, it seems like we're halfway to an Olmstead plan. Instead of approaching it in this piecemeal fashion where we're going after funding like this, for individual pockets of funding, can't we cobble together a 10-year living, breathing, working Olmstead plan? And then these two funding sources would most certainly be part of that plan. But then we could collectively brainstorm as to how the state could then provide for people who live with serious and persistent mental illness, people who live with physical disabilities. But it just seems like our leadership is going in the right direction and that we're laying a foundation. We just need to make a cohesive plan. Does anyone see that too, or does anyone disagree with that? Please, Mark, I think you're on mute.
Well, I want to say, we could spend a lot of time talking about how Rhode Island has so much catching up to do. But as someone who's been immersing himself in what Rhode Island has done, I was surprised to see, for example, that Rhode Island was so far along with a plan and a scheme to age-friendly in the community, and all the activities that were put together with that plan and the things that have already been done, perhaps not as successful as convincing the legislature to fund things or change certain laws and stuff, but so many other things have been done. And it's very interesting to me because what usually happens is 20 years ago or so, people would have developed an Olmstead plan, which for most states meant that you were narrowly addressing the issue of how the heck are we going to get that wait list down? The people in institutions waiting for community services, how do we address this, get that wait list moving at a pace that Sandra Day O'Connor would think would be great, so that we can avoid getting sued or getting in trouble or losing our federal funding. That was a narrow focus. And Connecticut certainly did that. And then, of course, that led to long-term care planning, which led to other things. And of course, Connecticut had one of the 8 pioneering nursing home transition programs, which I was the part of starting. And by the way, our state didn't want to do it. We rammed it down the state's throat. And the Connecticut Association of Centers for Independent Living actually became sort of like the state in its role. But we did this, and as we were doing nursing home transition, that's when it came out, my God, we can't achieve this without doing something about housing. We can't achieve this without doing something about transportation. We can't achieve this without building a pool of personal assistance. We can't, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so eventually we got to where we were. Well, Rhode Island doesn't start with an Olmstead plan, okay? Doesn't have one. So you think it'll be stuck there, but actually it's doing a lot of the things and getting some of the same results that Connecticut did. So it did take a different route, but it's doing those things. It's just not focused or connected necessarily to Olmstead. That's my view of it.
Yeah.
Well, we actually do have Olmstead plans. We just happen to develop them over at the U.S. District Court rather than as a reaction. And Bob can certainly talk about what we did and how we got into that system in which the state still is under the jurisdiction of the district court in its attempt to integrate folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Yeah, I mean, it is true. I mean, that's what's driving that is the consent decree at this point, which started as a sheltered workshop issue and expanded into residential. The problem with doing it that way is it didn't bring the legislature from the beginning. It brought them, in chains, basically. When they got, they had to sign a consent decree in order to get out of the courts. And, that's not really the way to do things. And it also, again, is focused on a specific group of people that were in need of services that day that we went to court and their cohort. And everybody that's older than them and everybody that's younger than them is paying the price for the fact that they are kind of almost getting what they need. But they're getting it at the expense of, like I said, people like my brother that are older that were already through that system, before it happened. And, he's just, but because the finances issues, his services have decreased, even though his need for services haven't changed at all. And then the people trying to get out of school now are hitting, well, everything that we've got is getting put towards the people in the consent decree. And, you we're just going to kind of shop you around for a couple of years and see if maybe we get lucky. So,
Mary, I have a question for you since you're a mental health expert. SAMHSA, which is the acronym for Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, it's a federal agency, outlines 4 dimensions of recovery for people: health, home, community, and purpose. How would an Olmstead plan help people in recovery with these dimensions?
I think that, that's a great question. I think to a certain degree, we started to talk about that with Bob when he was talking about housing and the separation from where you live to where you receive services. When you think about that separation, an Olmstead plan would allow us to outline how we're going to programmatically achieve these elements of recovery. So take housing, for example, using a permanent supported housing model where flexible services were near and integrated into that living environment, so that if one needed behavioral health services or whatever the need may be, quite frankly, you would have those services at hand, and it wouldn't require removing somebody from their living situation, which is essentially what we do now, and driving them to an emergency room because the situation has become unmanageable. If services were closer to and integrated in the living situation, you could prevent a lot of that sort of dramatic separation of individual from home and familiar environment. So an Olmstead plan to me would be able to contemplate, how do we configure services that are accessible and immediately adjacent or integrated into a living situation where appropriate. I think similarly, one of the things over time that we've seen is we've removed purposeful and meaningful activity from the experience of, the individual who's suffering from serious mental illness or, a significant intellectual or developmental disability. Social and vocational programming is often absent and unavailable, within one's living situation or within the community rather. So an Olmstead plan, in my mind, would contemplate how do we restore these critical elements of recovery to provide for a much more meaningful life for these folks who are able and want to be integrated into the community from which they came into the system originally. So it sounds certainly far easier than it's going to be. I think we also have to be careful not to design an Olmstead plan that contemplates these dimensions of recovery, but then puts everybody in the same basket. So regardless of whether you're suffering from a severe mental illness or a serious physical disability or an intellectual or developmental disability, it has to be unique enough and responsive enough to meet those specific needs. And quite frankly, it has to be client-centered. So it has to take the individual's desire into account, so that we don't contemplate a system and then try to fit people into the components. This has to be driven from what the individual needs are. And I think it's possible. It's a big task. I think, yes, that we're one of 7 states that doesn't have an Olmstead plan, but Olmstead plans vary greatly in terms of how they're designed and configured. And quite frankly, one of the most significant components of this is going to be funding. So as you sit back and think about how do we put these things together, and at the end of the day, if we create a system where folks are far more integrated into the community, supportive work, supportive housing if needed. I do think the financial burden will be less over time, but getting there, the investment in the planning process itself and then configuring the system is going to be a significant one. But, you know, again, I keep pointing to the fact that there's a hearing right now going on that is supposed to save millions of dollars, you know, for Eleanor Slater, and maybe some of those dollars should come this way and help us build that community network that could help us do this job really well.
That would be wonderful if that happened.
We should also keep in mind that the largest provider of psychiatric help in this state is our Department of Corrections.
Yes.
Between 70 and 80% of their clients have intellectual disabilities, substance use disorders, physical impairments. Some of them acquire them after they get there. But that has to also be a component. And that's also a place where if we had a better system of justice, that we would be diverting a large portion of their current clientele into appropriate support services, so they never end up stuck in the system that we've got now. I don't understand why, if somebody calls 911 and says, my husband's just locked himself in the bedroom with a loaded gun, we aren't sending the EMTs with the police. And if somebody's running down the street naked, why do we even need the police? There's enough money in the system. It's just a lot of it's wasted.
You've previewed our second town hall, which will be on October 28th. I hope everyone will join us. We will be discussing the criminalization of mental illness and developmental disabilities and other disabilities. We know that between 400 and 500 inmates are currently incarcerated at the Adult Correctional Institute because untreated symptoms of mental illness led them to have contact with the criminal justice system. Many of them might have been living on the streets at the time, cycling between emergency room departments, stays in hospitals that weren't funded because they don't have insurance, homeless shelters. So you're absolutely right that we pay one way or the other. The question is, do we want to be smart about it and make a plan so that we're paying upfront for individuals to have humane, dignified treatment and services in the setting that their disability allows, the setting of their choice? Or do we continue to neglect a plan and then have all of these reactive situations where not taking care of someone has led them to be hospitalized or be incarcerated? But this is the topic of our second town hall, and I hope everyone will join us. One question I have that ties into funding. So Rhode Island, like many states right now, is struggling financially. We're really hoping that the federal government will pass a state aid relief package. Even if it does, we're still not in great shape. What are some things that we can do now that don't cost money because perhaps it's a change in a process or an administrative protocol, or things that might cost little bit of money, not too much money, but what could we do now if we had an Olmstead plan with the same funding situation we have right now? What could be done?
You know, I do think if we're talking about Rhode Island and, you know, we already have two elements of funding to run with, and I'm going to focus on the START program. with the investment in this evidence-based approach to caring for those who have intellectual and developmental disabilities. You know, I think for us as providers, we can start the process of working really hard to create those necessary relationships and linkages with between, you know, hospital providers and community mental health centers and, you know, the DD residential settings, so that we're all working together to make sure that these programs that are emerging are a success. You know, when resources are limited, we all start to get very protective about our own, you know, our own stuff, you know, what solves our problem. And I think, you know, as these limited but important funding opportunities do come, to really work hard together and collaborate across the continuum to make sure that we're keeping the individual's needs at the center of the decisions we make, and to have some flexibility in that. I do think, and we've tried, you know, we've been doing some of that already, but we get stuck because of the lack of a full continuum. But we're starting to see elements added. You know, the crisis stabilization unit that just opened. Again, the START program that is going to emerge. I do think it's a great opportunity for us as providers to really focus on a collaboration that keeps the individual's needs, you know, at the center of what we do. I think that's going to be a big part of our success here. And then I think that just, you know, points us towards the ability to bring stakeholders together to develop a meaningful Olmstead plan.
Thank you, Mary. That was great. Anyone else want to chime in on what we could be doing now that wouldn't cost too much money?
Maybe if rather than building a new $63 million psychiatric hospital, we can divert at least the interest payments into providing more options in the community. Got to be better than just some more bricks and mortar.
Our third integration for all town hall, which will take place in mid-November after the election, will focus on the nuts and bolts of an Olmstead plan, particularly around how to fund it, what other states have done, what we could do. I have lots of ideas I'd love to pick your brains on. We have some questions from the audience. Kathy is writing, how can the shortage of affordable, supportive housing be addressed? Where will people go? That's a really big question, and I feel like that's one of the major gaps we have in Rhode Island, is that we don't have enough affordable housing for people. And that directly relates to people with disabilities who, if they are living on their own, they often receive SSI or SSDI benefits, which we all know are fairly limited. And that makes finding affordable housing in a place like Rhode Island very, very difficult because we do have overpriced housing. So can anyone else speak to the issue of affordable, supportive housing for people?
I think a big part is that separating. I think we've got to get the money. We're putting money into housing for these people now. We're just putting it in a way that it's not accessible to them. And I think, you know, I think we need to move towards something similar to, you know, at least on the DDs, on the IDD side, to, you know, when you get that initial qualification, it should be assumed that you're going to need housing that's affordable, because it's quite unlikely you're not. I mean, unless you're going to get elected to Congress and get a nice salary, you're not going to be able to afford housing in Rhode Island on your own. And I think so that instead of buying and building more congregate settings, even for the people that need congregate settings for a period of time, they should be in there with a voucher that they can take right back out the door with them when they're done. And I think if you put more vouchers into the system, and you do the other piece of eliminating Rhode Island's law that allows landlords to not take vouchers, that will go a long way towards beginning it. There is a shortage overall, but if they have to take the vouchers, and if more vouchers are available, the market will develop the housing to take those vouchers. So I think that's a big piece of it, is getting that money out of the prisons, out of out of Buda, out of, all of the other places where we've tied housing to services. And even for the people that are in that situation, using that model, they should be buying the housing portion of that with a voucher that can go elsewhere.
And Bob, I'm so glad you mentioned that here in Rhode Island, we might be one of the only New England states that does not prohibit landlords from discriminating against vouchers. This past session in the General Assembly, there was legislation pending that would have enacted that prohibition against discrimination, but it didn't go anywhere because of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll be following it again in 2021, and I hope you all will as well. It's really something important that needs to happen for Rhode Islanders.
In past years, it's always gotten out of the Senate and has always died in the House.
Yeah, I don't think it didn't pass because of COVID. I've been following it for a while too, and I don't think we were anywhere near passage this year, whether COVID happened or not. It does need to get addressed, but I think it's something that we need to come at jointly, so that everybody that needs affordable housing gets on the same page and pushes together, instead of, just the poor pushing, and that's it. I mean, I think the entire disability community needs this, and they should be right out there with everybody else and pushing both for more housing to be developed and for the vouchers to not be discriminatory.
And we also need to ensure that we get more voices up when the neighborhood opportunities legislation comes in every year. That has a big component for supportive housing. And it's driven from the housing end of the system, not from the disability service end of the system. But we don't get a lot of other disability advocates who show up. You get the homeless advocates, you get Rhode Island Housing, but you frequently don't have the rest of the system. And we also need to keep in mind that people frequently have crossed the buckets within the disability community, whether it's you're self-medicating yourself, so you've got physical disability and you also have substance use. That's why, as Bob said, if we can all get behind something for housing availability through an existing integrated housing system, then at least we've started to break out between your need for lots of services, or even just few services, from where you live.
Charles Feldman is asking Mark Anthony, you mentioned that you rammed change down Connecticut's throat. How did you do that? How might one go about that?
Actually, that was specifically, I was referring to how we started the nursing facility transition program in Connecticut, which was very important to us because it opened up doors to so many things. Because for years, as disability advocates, we would go to the legislature or the governor or whatever and say, hey, it's cheaper to have people in the community than in an institution. And we had this legislator from New Haven, who was the original show me the money type guy. And he would say, oh yeah, show me, prove to me you could save me money. I'm on the appropriations committee, I'm a chair. And if you could show that we save money, then well, how do you show that you can save money if you can't actually do the activity to move people out? We had no personal assistance program. We were one of the last states to adopt a personal assistance program. We had nothing. So Olmstead comes about. Yay! I was so happy for that because I participated in the lawsuits and the street demonstrations and everything. So Olmstead comes along, and Bill Clinton's on his way out, and George Bush is on his way in. But they both agree that, wow, you know what? The federal government has to have a carrot and a stick here. We have to offer states money to do demonstration programs. And then we also have to hit them over the head if they're not complying with Olmstead. So we said, great, super, we're gonna apply for this. So we went to the state, and the Department of Social Service was like, not interested, not happening, not doing it. Everywhere we went, nope, we're not interested. Nope, nope, not happening, nope, not doing it. And you need to have a state partner. The state has to actually apply for it. So we found an individual who's still involved, God bless him, in all these Olmstead implementation and everything else in Connecticut. His name is David Goodchin. And he was actually with the Office of Policy and Management. He says, you know what? If you guys write it and set it all up, I'll sign it. So we lent the executive director of the Connecticut Association of Centers for Independent Living, Dawn Limber, to the state of Connecticut for 2.5 months. And she was in David Goodchin's office writing this plan. Dawn today is the director of MFP in Connecticut. And so she wrote it. So then the state says, well, you know, we'll see if we get it. Connecticut was one of 8 states who was awarded it. So he said, great, we got the award. We could start, super. So now we go back and the same people are saying, sorry, we don't care if you got the award. We're not taking it. We're not doing it. We don't believe it's worthwhile. And besides, we got all these state employees retiring. And we don't have anybody to oversee this. So David Goodchin found a person who was retiring, who was willing to sign off on our reports. And the Connecticut Association of Centers for Independent Living became like the state agency in charge of it, which was weird because the Centers for Independent Living were also the one doing the transition. So there was kind of a built-in conflict there because we were managing the contract, managing ourselves and holding ourselves accountable. It's really bizarre. But anyways, lo and behold, on the first the first 27 people we moved out, we demonstrated that we saved the state $4.2 million. Wow. And it was evidence-based, we demonstrated. Now, Governor Rowland, who most people remember is the guy who had to resign because of a hot tub, Governor Rowland heard about this. He says, you guys are doing a great job. This is wonderful. Guess what? When the grant's over, we're putting state money into it. And so it became an official state program until 2008, when all these programs become part of the Medicaid program, became money for hours a person. So that's how we basically rammed it down their throat. Our state refused. They thought it was stupid and pointless. And we did it. And we were able to prove that we saved money. And so now we have one of the most successful and vigorous money for hours a person programs in the country. Not without a problem, but it's very good.
Excellent. That was inspirational. Thank you, Mark Anthony. Brenda is asking, how can housing advocacy groups help push for an Olmstead plan? How can other groups get involved in this work?
I think, you know, if indeed we proceed and start to work towards developing a plan, and, you know, I, preparing for this evening, did a little bit of poking around to see how states approach developing plans. And, you know, one of the critical elements is the stakeholder participation. So it seems to me that in that process, it would be important to engage the housing advocates and really think about how, you know, what this looks like if we put it down on paper, and how we work together to address the housing needs in a meaningful and successful way for those with disabilities.
Please, yes.
I am shocked at the lack of housing vouchers in Rhode Island. I am completely shocked, especially for people who are transitioning out of nursing homes. We have a person on staff here at Ocean State that does nursing home transitions, and she does an unbelievable job considering the limited resources that she has. In Connecticut, we recognized a long time ago that a lot of people were in nursing homes and other institutions, not because they had a medical need, not because they needed 24/7, but because they didn't have any housing for whatever reason. Or sometimes they were sick so long or in a nursing home and they lost their housing. And now, of course, the government is taking all their money for their applied income in a nursing home. So they have no deposit. They lost their furniture, they lost everything, have no way of getting out. So we realized that affordable, accessible housing was key to this. So again, the hot tub governor said, you know what? We are gonna put up $201 million to the Connecticut Finance Authority to finance housing vouchers. And this way, when somebody's ready to leave a nursing home, they don't have to get on a Section 8 waiting list. They're getting a voucher just like that. And that's been a secret to our success. If somebody needs a housing voucher, as soon as they are ready to leave the nursing home, they get the housing voucher and out they go. Now, I remember when we first started talking about this before Governor Rowland came along to the state legislature. Oh my God, you know how expensive that is? You're asking us to pay for housing. There could be thousands of people who are paying for housing. And we used to say, guess what? You already have a housing program that's very expensive. It's called the nursing home program, where you pay thousands of dollars a month to house each individual in a nursing home. You could actually spend less money out in the community on an apartment. And that used to be our argument. And Governor Rowland, I got to tell you, a lot of people criticize him, but to his credit, he recognized it. And it's key. And I'm astounded that here in Rhode Island, we have people moving out of nursing homes and they just have to get on the Section 8 waiting list just like everybody else. And guess what? They have a medical emergency, end up in a hospital or something. When their name gets called, boom, back to the bottom of the list. That's crazy. I don't understand that. That's one change I would make in Rhode Island.
Excellent.
We should also keep in mind that the General Assembly had an Olmstead Commission writing the state's Olmstead plan for 9 years. And it never went anywhere. They used to publish reports. Part of the problem was that I think the General Assembly created the commission more just to have a place to push people off that wanted to do make some changes. But I'm not sure we can wait for the state's Secretariat for Health and Human Services to develop a plan. We may need, as advocates and providers and consumers, to start the process ourselves. And as Mark Anthony mentioned, sort of deliver it to both the legislature and the state government.
Yeah, good point. Bob Marshall, I think I have a question that might be for you. Kathy is asking, oh no, I'm sorry. Katie is asking, can you talk about the lack of funding for adults with disabilities who also have extensive health challenges? So, developmental, intellectual disabilities, but also medical complications.
A lot of that is being driven right now by the lack of ability for the rate system at Buddha to address those, which was one of the things that I kind of mentioned quickly and didn't have time to get into it, was those financial things that hit in the 80s and 90s. There was something called Project Sustainability, which redid all of the DD rate system. And they did a nice study and they figured out what everything was supposed to cost. No one's ever seen that study, unfortunately, because when they figured out what everything was supposed to cost, it was more money than they had. So then they just re-engineered everything backwards. And what happened with that is where the two biggest problems, I think, came was the people with very heavy medical and behavioral needs never got what they really needed. And the people with the least needs that probably with some initial investment could eventually actually save a lot of money, didn't get what they needed. And so they never moved, they can't move forward and get to be more independent and actually need less money because they're just not getting anything because they can kind of coast along without getting into crisis. And so I think that's a lot of the problem. The state right now is doing another similar study to fix the problems with its rate system for IDD. Hopefully we will see it this time. The legislature has gotten involved this time. That might help. There's been a commission looking at project sustainability and what happened, and they've been demanding to see the new study. And I think if we can get it to where it actually makes sense, then people should be able to plan a life that they want, even around those very heavy medical needs, and just work them into the plan. And then the other piece is the thing that I talked about is if you can do some more up front and get more real community integration for people that have those needs, some of that stuff that you can't get paid for now might free up funds that you're using for other things. That could be just part of the, once you got integrated in the community, you wouldn't really need as much anymore.
Thank you, Bob. Charlie Feldman says that peer support services, which are evidence-based, cost less than paying providers. So how can we incorporate peer support services into an Olmstead plan model? I imagine that perhaps peer supports could visit people in their homes and provide support. And you have some thoughts, Mary?
Yeah, no, I was, in my temporary job at the Providence Center, I'm spending a lot of time understanding the peer support program and the benefits therein. And I think that's exactly right. It's about having, consumers who have experienced the challenges, working with individuals who may be in transition from a higher level of residential or hospital care to community. And, that support and that understanding from the peer, can be far more impactful at times than that which a clinician or provider might be able to offer. So, and it is, far more cost effective, certainly, but more importantly, it's just simply more effective. We integrate peers in all settings here at the hospital. Prior to the COVID pandemic, peers were a big part of programming. So the understanding and the insight of someone who has had the experience of managing through recovery it is invaluable. So I think it would be important to make that a formal and funded component, for these community services, for sure.
And peer supports stretch throughout our community, whether it's the individual with a spinal cord injury who visits somebody in the hospital a week after they've tried to do a high dive off of the end of a dock someplace, throughout the system. But we also need to make sure that our state licensing laws don't exclude people based on their previous substance use or a lot of other things, from being able to be an integrated part and to some extent, whenever possible, paid for their integration, helping with transition, and in recovery.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is too that, we need to get in Rhode Island.
Oh, I'm sorry, Bob. I think you're frozen again.
Idea that everything's not going to be Medicaid reimbursable. Okay. Am I frozen again? I'm sorry.
You're good.
Let me see if I get back. Are we back? Okay.
You are, yes.
So I think a lot of it is, yeah, I got a lousy connection tonight. I think a lot of it is that we need to get to where if something's not Medicaid reimbursable, you've got to still pay for it if it makes sense and it's going to work long term. And that's Rhode Island has a real problem with that. It's like, you know, if you can't get federal government to pay for half of it, then they're not going to pay for any of it. And you know, that is, in the long term, they end up spending more money because of that.
One of our audience members, Jamie Partridge, wanted to echo some things that Mark Anthony had mentioned. And I would just like to mention, to read what Jamie says, because I think we haven't touched on this, but it's really important. Jamie says, rarely do restaurants or public stores have Braille menus or signs for people. Kids with vision loss are tested on standard tests for potential IEP plans in school rather than using adapted testing for their disability. Additionally, kids between the ages of 3 to 5 with vision loss are no longer eligible for early intervention, but aren't able to work with the state's Commission for the Blind. So if they don't go to preschool, they have no support options. Mark, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I think at there's 2 points being made in that common question. One is, you know, about the willingness, you know, to spend money if it's not Medicaid reimbursable. Of course, everything's not Medicaid reimbursable. And I think it's very important, going back to the comment I made about how, in a way, it was appropriate to quote Justice Ginsburg, because Justice Ginsburg was the one basically saying, this isn't a Medicaid problem. This really, you know, maybe the issue at hand narrowly is about Medicaid, but it's not a Medicaid problem. It's not even a medical problem. It's a society problem, and it's a community problem. And so the point is to be made there, you know, what about accessibility? You know, what about being able to go to a restaurant or go to a park or attend school or go to church or whatever? And that's true. One of the questions that was supposed to be maybe posed to me in a more formal way was, what does it look like if we implemented Olmstead, if we had all the money in the world to do it? What it would look like is a completely accessible, livable communities in Rhode Island. Because accessible, livable communities promote a whole new social way of being, as well as giving people barrier-free ways of participating in things. But it changes your whole attitude and everyone's relationship with one another. It's easy to forget about the people who end up in nursing homes or institutions or whatever if you're not neighbors with them, if you're not going to church with them, if you're not going to school, et cetera, et cetera. But when people are together and visible, it changes the way that people think. So I think that even though they're not Medicaid specific, in that limited sense, all of those elements about making our community more accessible are terribly important.
Well, any other comments before we say goodnight to one another? This has been really interesting, and I really want to thank all of our panelists who took time out of their very, very busy schedules to be with us tonight to teach us about Olmstead plans and what they can do for Rhode Island. Just a few closing remarks. As a reminder, we have another virtual town hall continuing this discussion on October 28th. You can sign up on our homepage. Actually, right now, it's on our homepage slider. And I also just want to close by saying that it's okay not to be okay right now. Times are tough for many of us. We're all living through a historical pandemic. We have massive unemployment. Some people have lost loved ones. Many of us are still isolating at home, and it's really tough on us. For those of us who live with a mental illness or some other type of a disability, of course, our symptoms are exacerbated by the stress of everything going on. And don't even get me started on our national news, which feels like a daily kick to the stomach. It just seems like every day we have more chaos and frustration and heartbreak and loss. And I'm encouraging everyone to take care of your mental health. Therapists and psychiatrists are seeing people in person with social distancing, and also over the telephone or in video chats. And if you feel like you need to talk to someone, please don't defer treatment, because we don't know when the pandemic will end. Get help today, because you deserve to feel better today. That's all I have for tonight. And I thank all of our panelists again. And I want to thank all of our audience members for their great questions. I hope this was interesting and helpful. My goal is to have an Olmstead plan in Rhode Island within the next year. And I think if we work together, we can do this. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Good night, everyone. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Right.